Happy 4th of July, everybody. I didn't record a live stream last week because my phone has been acting up lately. For some reason, the screen will start glitching and scrambling, and it hasn't been doing that today, so I'm going to try to do a live stream this week. But instead of talking about psychology and mental health, since today's the 4th of July, it just so happened to be a perfect opportunity to talk about history, which I haven't gotten to talk about yet, and especially one of my favorite historical subjects tonight, the American Revolution, and what an amazing story there is behind the fight for America's freedom. So, the thing about the American Revolution, and this is kind of a problem with history in general, is the version we learn in high school, which is the version most people are familiar with, is somewhat inaccurate. There's a lot of myths, a lot of misconceptions out there about the historical events, and so I don't like to sugarcoat history. I sort of like to demythologize it and get past the epic, larger-than-life characters and sort of look at the real human beings that are behind it and get you to feel like you're really there and understanding what was going on in the world at the time, because these events didn't happen in a vacuum. But before we get started, because whenever I'm talking about a particular subject, I like to show you my sources so you know that I'm not just making up stuff, and you can fact check me and I can't get accused of plagiarism or anything like that. It's just smart whenever you're talking about something scholarly or academic to cover yourself like that. So I've got two excellent books on the American Revolution. One is 1776 by David McAuliffe, and he's also the author of the famous biopic on John Adams. Tony Williams has an excellent book called The Hurricane of Independence, and what this book does is it, unbeknownst to a lot of people, this is something that's kind of forgotten to history in general, is that a hurricane actually struck the United States shortly after the Declaration of Independence was signed, and there was a big controversy in the colonies at the time over what did it mean. Was it a divine symbol from God that, it was the wrath or the judgment of God for declaring our independence from Great Britain? What was that all about? And people were back and forth about what it meant. Actually, the hurricane is mentioned in Patrick Henry's famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." And it devastated the coast of North Carolina and swept throughout the entire colonies. And so the author actually follows the hurricane, but then he uses the hurricane to sort of tell you more about, with each area it hit, Philadelphia, and how people reacted to it. How did George Washington, how did Benjamin Franklin react to it? And then introduce you into those different characters. Also, the Oxford Companion to Military History. As you can see, this is a very thick book. I haven't read the entire book cover to cover, I'll admit that, but this is an excellent reference book. So any war, any conflict that's ever happened, you can just look it up in this book like an encyclopedia. It can tell you everything you need to know. It's a very scholarly academic source. So, I'm telling you all the truth tonight, talking about the American Revolution. So when we start with the Revolution, obviously the first question is, what is America? And what makes America different in the world is that most nations can't really define when and where they started. When you talk about England, when you talk about France, when you talk about really any nation, nobody can definitively say, when did people first arrive here and when did we start as a nation? But with the United States, we can define that. We can say it was July 4th. Well, there's actually some controversy of whether it was actually July 4th or should it have been July 2nd or whatever. But to me, that doesn't matter. That's not really important. So we started in 1776 in July. We signed a Declaration of Independence. We announced our secession from Great Britain, and we fought a Revolutionary War over it. And so what are we founded on? And we're the only nation that can actually point to specific ideals that we were founded on. And those are the principles and ideals of the Enlightenment. So what is the Enlightenment? If I start talking about that, I'm going to go on for hours and I'm going to bore you all to tears. So I'm going to try to cut through that. But the Enlightenment begins with René Descartes, a philosopher in the 1400s who wrote the famous phrase, "I think, therefore I am." And so that led to the beginning of a change in thought in Western civilization. So if you go back to Europe and civilization before then, what had gone on in Europe was two things. One was monarchy and one was obedience to the church. Specifically, if not the Catholic Church, really the Catholic Church, but orthodoxy in general. And there's a particular reason why we have an idea like separation of church and state. And I know Christians today, modern evangelical Christians in America hate that phrase. We don't like to hear it. But what separation of church and state means and what the founders intended was that, there's something about a state-run church. In England, they had the Church of England, and it's the official state-recognized religion, but it can be in cahoots with the monarchy. So your king is your king, and he's the king because God appointed him to be king. And you know that God appointed him to be king because the priest and, the church, the official state-run church said so. And so, divine monarchy is, God appointed this person to be king over you, and to obey him is the same as obeying God. And so his children, his descendants, his heirs are divinely appointed. Now, you could say, well, what happens if he gets overthrown and a new dynasty takes over? Well, then, God was on the side of that dynasty. So that's why we have separation of church and state. There is no state-run religion. And the founders put that, something to that effect. That phrase, separation of church and state, isn't in the Constitution, but at the very beginning, the idea, at least, that's in the First Amendment is the founders did not want monarchy in the United States, and that's why they put that in there, that there will be no official state-run religion, and everybody has the freedom and the rights to practice, worship any god they want to, any religion they want to. And so for hundreds of years, there were all these philosophers that came along throughout Western civilization that came up with these ideas of freedom, of personal liberty. And they were opposed to monarchy, and this idea of the divine right of kings just started unraveling over the centuries. And there's so many interesting things that contribute to that. You can even say, the Copernican revolution had something to do with that. The idea that, mankind discovered that we're not the center of the universe after all, that we're actually a small planet wandering out there in space, and that we actually revolve around the sun. The sun doesn't revolve around us. And then that paves the way for Galileo and then for Isaac Newton. And you have a lot of these scientific thinkers. People start getting scientific during the Enlightenment. It's called the scientific revolution. And so we start perfecting our methods of scientific inquiry. And then you have philosophers like John Locke who come along and write all these things about personal liberty and personal freedom and what is the ideal government, that government should have three branches. And so you start seeing this backlash against monarchy, which had been in Europe for so many hundreds of years. And so you also have the French Revolution as well that happened shortly after ours, although it will play out very differently from ours. But there's this backlash against the idea of a state-run religion and against monarchy that's been standard in Europe for so many centuries before that. And America, you could say, is the first nation founded on that as a unique principle. The principles that we are founded on are personal liberty, personal freedom, the right to a free market, the right to private property, the right to speak and say your mind, to openly criticize the government. And we're one of the great exceptions of that in human history, and sometimes we call it the Great American Experiment. And if we go back and look at the American Revolution, and not the sugar-coated version that you hear in schools or the mythologized version that people teach, where people like George Washington today are kind of viewed as these deified figures, these mythical, larger-than-life, almost godlike figures that we look at in awe, and you see statues of them and monuments to them in Washington, D.C., but they were real people. They were human beings. They were flawed persons. And so who are the real men behind that? And what kind of struggles did they go through? The American Revolution was almost a complete, utter disaster, and it almost shouldn't have succeeded. And you'll see throughout time that it seemed like everything was stacked against the American Revolution to keep it from succeeding. So we'll start one of the things that's interesting is that not long before the Revolution, maybe about 20 years, there was a war called the French and Indian War. For a variety of complicated reasons, I'm not going to get into that. So the 13 colonies have been established, obviously, and, a lot of the immigrants came to the colonies to flee religious persecution from King James and so on and so forth. So, but we really start with the French and Indian War. That's when George Washington saw action for the first time. And actually, George Washington is a very conflicting character to read about. I mean, he's viewed as larger than life to us today, but in real life, Washington's first encounter with combat was a complete disaster. So he was leading a small group of a small army, and he came across accidentally a group of French missionaries, and these emissaries were actually not enemy combatants. They were actually delivering a peace message. And this led to a terrible slaughter that happened. And through some misunderstanding, Washington thought that they were the enemy. And so he attacked them, and he physically led them in just this brutal slaughter. And so these French emissaries, most of them were killed. Some of them were taken captive. And so when Washington realized his mistake, he sends a letter to his head commander saying, don't listen to them. They don't know what they're talking about. And he lies about himself, and he lies about what actually happened. So the whole story about George Washington, cutting down the cherry tree and saying, I shall not tell a lie, that's all complete mythology. Washington was a good liar and a bit of a narcissist, actually. And so you see that early on in his career. So the French and Indian War, when Britain and the colonies win the war and defeat the French, there's a lot of fervor, there's a lot of pride, and it's kind of amazing that the American colonies are never more proud to be British subjects than at the end of the French and Indian War. And there's a lot of pride in being part of Great Britain. And so how do you get from that to within 20 years, a revolution where they want to leave Great Britain? So the thing about the British Empire is the largest and most powerful empire the world has ever seen. And you've heard that plenty of times. It's unbelievable how under such overwhelming circumstances the American colonies could stand up and fight for their freedom from the most powerful empire in the world. But they didn't get that way by being nice. I mean, they were a brutal empire. And you could say some of the worst atrocities ever committed were by the British to establish the largest empire in the world. They had troops and colonies established in almost all four corners of the globe by that point. So the problem with the colonies was obviously taxation. And so the thing about war is that it's very expensive. So Britain had won the French and Indian War, but now they were in debt over it. And so there's a question of how do we resolve the debt? And one of the ideas they came up with was to tax the colonies. So they enacted a series of taxes after the war, and the colonists were obviously really ticked off about that. And the reason why, I mean, they fought. It was their territory. They fought alongside the British and helped defeat the French. And so they thought it was unfair. But it's not just the taxation. The phrase, no taxation without representation, it's not so much that they got taxed, it's that they didn't get a say in it. And they said, well, we fought and we're British subjects. I mean, we're citizens of Great Britain as much as anybody, so we should have gotten a say-so in that. And so they were furious about that. And when the Tea Act was passed, Boston was the place hardest hit because they had all the tea imports and trades that came through Boston Harbor. And so a lot of businesses in the colonies were hurt by that. Severely damaged. And so there was a lot of anger, a lot of rage, a lot of resentment towards the British. It was stirred up. But contrary to popular belief, it's not like the colonies were trying to go to war. They knew it was a big risk and a big gamble. And the colonies were doing everything they could to try to make peace with Great Britain. And Great Britain was having none of it. And so while Parliament was enacting all these taxes and the colonists were just outraged and filing petitions and asking, protesting and whatnot, Parliament was reacting with military force. They were saying, well, if the colonists are going to be unruly like this, we're just going to send troops over and we're going to impose martial law on them and we're going to demand their subservience. And, if they don't like it, tough, they're just going to have to learn to like it. And this was just stoking the flames even further. But when the Continental Congresses first started to convene, they were talking about how to avoid war with Britain. They didn't necessarily want to declare their independence or anything, and they sent petitions to King George. So they go to King George and they ask him, look, we're not happy right now. And King George is known to this day as the man who lost the American colonies, fairly or otherwise, whether he deserves his reputation as an incompetent leader. He missed a golden opportunity here, because the back and forth with the British Parliament versus the monarchy over who has the most power, I mean, this was a long-standing fight, and by going to the king had an opportunity to side with the colonies against Parliament, which could have given him more power than he had, but he didn't take it. In fact, when King George received the olive branch petition from the American colonies, he tore it up and threw it on the ground. He was so enraged by it. So he missed out on that great opportunity, and he immediately went, and in Parliament there was actually a lot of controversy. We tend to, in pop culture, portray the British as the bad guys and the villains or whatever. But King George immediately went to Parliament and made a speech announcing his decision to invade and, punish. He compared the colonies to children, and he said they are unruly children and they need immediate, strictest discipline possible. So he intended to send troops to initiate a war and a hostile invasion of the colonies to get them to be subservient again. But now in Parliament, this wasn't necessarily a unanimous decision. There were a lot of, in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, there were a lot of British lords who were opposed to this action and said it's a mistake to go against the American colonies and try to discipline and go to war with them. We need to try to strike peace with them and give them what they want and try to negotiate with them. But all of those fell apart. So in Boston is where the tensions were the highest, and so that's where the British hit the hardest, and they sent British General Thomas Gage to basically impose martial law, and that just stirred the Bostonians up even more. And so there was a lot of riots, there was a lot of anger. You've heard of the famous incident where the British actually opened fire on a mob in the American colonies and killed 13 people. Now, to be fair, the Americans were really, really antagonizing the British troops at that moment, and it sort of turned into a propaganda campaign. So all over America, the American colonies, the word was spreading that the British opened fire on innocent American civilians and killed them, and what are we going to do about this? And so, the American colonists did have good propaganda skills when they needed them. So the beginning of the war started at the Battle of Lexington, and nobody knows. It was really more of a minor skirmish, and nobody knows. We've heard about the famous shot heard around the world. Nobody knows who fired the first shot, but you had two standing armies on either side of the field, staring each other down. Nobody knows if it was the British or if it was the American colonists, but somebody fired first, and there was a minor skirmish that broke out. Then later at the Battle of Concord, Lexington was a minor British victory. The colonist militia scattered, but they led the British into a trap at Concord. And so when the British they heard that there was a weapons cache that was being used to fund the rebellion, and there were cannons and guns and rifles everywhere, and so they went to a farmhouse to try to investigate. And the colonists, the militia, had gotten there first and actually moved all the cannons and guns and bullets out of the farmhouse and hid them in the woods and the trees surrounding the farmhouse, pointed directly at the British troops. So the British troops were unarmed at that moment. They put their guns down and had gotten shovels and pitchforks, and they were digging through this barn and tearing the boards down and, sort of moving piles of hay around trying to find guns and cannons, not realizing those guns and cannons were actually pointed at them. And so that was a slaughter. So the British the Redcoats ran from that. And so, but the war really escalated at Boston, obviously. So since martial law had been imposed in Boston and the British troops, the Redcoats, had pretty much had that city as a stronghold, what the colonists did to react to that was there's a hill overlooking Boston called Bunker Hill. And so the colonists actually got up there and established a small fort. And, there's an advantage in warfare, especially back then, that whoever has the high ground has the advantage. Because, if you're an attacker, you have to go uphill, and that's a harder climb versus if you're up at the top and you can just rain fire down below on them. And so the colonists had the high ground, and they were able to siege Boston and cut off supplies to the British army that was stationed there. And so the General Thomas Gage and his troops were basically trapped and cut off from the outside world, and they couldn't receive any assistance from the British Navy. And so this went on for a couple of months, and then Thomas Gage basically realized the only way is to fight our way out of this. So he led his army out of the city and had to attack directly the hill, Bunker Hill, where the colonist fort was entrenched, and the result was an absolute bloodbath. It showed for the first time that the American colonists could actually hold up their own against the British army in combat. And the British technically won the victory. They did drive the colonists out and destroyed the fort, but it was a costly victory. It was just absolute bloodshed, and they were mowed down as they came rushing up the hill. So the whole thing was a disaster. So the war was really on at that point. However, now the American colonies were overconfident, because what they had been fighting at Lexington, Concord, and at Bunker Hill was not really the full force of the British Empire. It was just a small cut-off army that had been sent to maintain the peace and keep control in the region. And so now that war had been declared, they really didn't realize what they were in for. So the Continental Congress convened, and George Washington had retired from military service after the French and Indian War. And it could be argued Washington knew they wanted him, and he was kind of being teased he showed up in his military uniform. He'd been an invited guest, and the crowd was wowed by him. Wow, General Washington is here, and so they appointed him to be the general who would lead the rebellion against England. Now, Washington, however, made some serious blunders as soon as he took command. And so the real target for England now was New York, because New York was the economic center. I mean, that was the largest city. And so if you could cut off New York and capture it, you could begin to really strangle the colonies and strangle the rebellion. So when the British Navy arrived, the colonists really weren't expecting it. And when they looked out over the harbor, there was a boy who was an eyewitness who said it looked like a city of wooden ships. Like, you could see the mast of the wooden ships of the British Navy, and it stretched on as far as the eye could see. It seemed like all of London had come and set sail to America. And so the result was one of the most catastrophic defeats for the entire American colonies during the war. The siege of New York was horrible. The British just showed up, and that's when the full force of the British Empire came down on the colonies, and with their cannons aimed at the city of New York, they just pulverized it, absolutely devastated it. And so when George Washington went to meet them in battle, he met them at Long Island, and the Battle of Long Island was the first time that a major battle of the American Revolution would happen. And so Washington shows up, and he's hopelessly outnumbered. But he makes a critical error at that point. He decided to divide his forces up and attack the British from two different angles. And the result was a catastrophic loss. And the American colonists were just nearly wiped out. And so the full force of the British came down. So they retreated from New York. New York was lost. It became a British stronghold. And the colonists and Washington and his army fled in catastrophic defeat. And there were eyewitnesses who said Washington was out there with a club beating his men as they were retreating. They were trying to flee for their lives, and he was trying to beat them to get them to turn around and go back into battle with the British. Washington was really frustrated with that, and he was known to impose pretty strict discipline on his men as well. Because when he arrived and took control of the Continental Army, it was an embarrassment. I mean, there was no discipline. These were young men from all over the colonies who were caught up in this patriotic fervor of defeating England, but not really knowing what they were in for. So Washington retreats and the British capture New York. But the British make an error themselves at this point, and so it's now, when it gets close to December, there's also a strategic victory up in the north. So Henry Knox, the guy that Fort Knox is named after, Washington sends him up north to Canada to capture Fort Ticonderoga, which was a British stronghold, and there was a lot of British arms there. And it was actually a miraculous raid, and it was a surprise attack that the British didn't see coming. And so he was able to successfully capture Fort Ticonderoga and take all the guns and cannons and everything out of it and use it for the war effort for the colonies. So there were some good American victories early on. And so as the British are now coming down on the colonies hard, Washington is sort of the way we saw Osama bin Laden today. He was viewed as a terrorist, and he was viewed as public enemy number one, and he was leading the army of a rebellion, and so, you know, he's going to be dealt with all the force imaginable. And Washington knew that, and so he knew he was on the run for his life, and so the first thing he had to do was whip this army into shape. So they were out hiding in the trees in the wilderness, and Washington actually saw an opportunity. So when winter set in, the British had decided, there was kind of an unspoken rule in combat at that time in Europe that you took Christmas off. You took the holidays off to spend time with your family. So the British generals had actually set sail for home to be with their families for Christmas Eve, assuming that the Americans would do the same thing. And they missed a terrible opportunity there. So Washington knew this was going to happen, and he saw an opportunity to strike. So on top of being the most brutal and feared fighting force in the entire world, the British also employed a group of German fighters called the Hessians. And the Hessians were sort of like the special ops of that time. They were one of the most feared fighting forces, and they were guns for hire. They weren't loyal to the British Crown or anyone, and they had really colorful, like yellow and purple uniforms, and but they were some of the most ruthless fighters in the known world, and they've been hired and employed to attack and assist Britain in this war. And I mean, Britain had lots of money. I mean, they could afford it. They could afford the best of the best. So the Hessians were stationed in Trenton, and this is not propaganda, although sometimes, you know, people who will try to rewrite history say that it is, but it is not colonial propaganda that the Hessians and the British Army did engage in atrocities following the fall of New York. I mean, there are real stories from the Hessian and the British soldier diaries of pillaging and plundering colonist towns, raping colonial women, committing the kind of atrocities that are unfortunately common during war and especially during invasions. So what happens next is the Hessians, Washington badly needs a victory. The Hessians are now stationed at Trenton, and their guard is down because it's Christmas Eve. And so they're partying, they're getting drunk, they're drinking the night before, they're not expecting an attack. The British aren't expecting an attack. So Washington is able to mobilize enough of his men for a daring late night raid. And this is one of his best moments during the war. And what he does is, you know, you've seen that famous picture of Washington crossing the Delaware River. So in the dead of night, with it freezing cold, probably below zero, the colonists get in boats and they sneak across the Delaware River for a surprise attack on Trenton the following morning. And the attack is a huge success. And not only that, the colonists defeat the Hessians in battle, and the Hessian head commander is killed. He's so surprised by the attack. I mean, they're drunk, they're hungover, and he's, you know, a battle begins. They get a surprise attack. He rushes out into the open streets, you know, trying to put his coat on and get his sword ready, and he's shot dead right there in the snow. And so it delivered a crushing blow to the Hessians, who were one of the most feared fighting forces in the world. And so this victory wasn't really that big of a deal to the British. The British more groaned as a minor inconvenience because it turns out the Americans hadn't laid down their arms and taken a break for Christmas anyway. But for the Americans, it was a huge morale booster. So the war continued from there. And if I keep going like this, I'm just going to go on and on. Just the war lasted 10 years. It was a long fight. But after these victories, you know, I'm not going to lecture you all about all of the details and histories of the American Revolution for hours and hours, but all I'll say as an overview, so you have the Battle of New York, which is a catastrophic loss for Washington. And after the tremendous victory at Trenton, he makes another similar defeat, and that's at the Battle of Brandywine. Brandywine is a crushing defeat. But there's two lessons that Washington learns from this, and these are very important lessons going forward from the war. He can't defeat Great Britain by going up against them in open armed conflict. He won't be able to do it. He's outgunned, he's outnumbered, and he's outmatched. So that affects the defeat at Brandywine, changes Washington's mindset of how to conduct the war from here on. And he realizes we have to carry out a slow war. We have to be very patient, and instead of addressing and confronting the British in the open, we need to lure them into our territory, and we need to just strike here and there, and we have to exhaust them chasing us through the wilderness, and we have to occasionally surprise attack them and rack up small victories here and there, and maybe we can win just by little cuts here and there. I think the term is death by 1,000 paper cuts. And Washington knows this is a long battle, a long war, and it's going to take a lot of resilience. And it wasn't the American colonists, the Continental Congress didn't necessarily share in Washington's enthusiasm. And so you have a lot of people, Washington today is viewed as this heroic, triumphant figure. But at the time, that was hardly the case. And, the Continental Congress, the Founding Fathers, the men who signed the Declaration of Independence, didn't necessarily view Washington in such a favorable light at this point. And actually, he was becoming extraordinarily unpopular. There were questions of whether he was even a competent general. And there was a lot of push to replace him as the general leader of the Continental Army. But Washington was not just a good general, he was also very politically savvy. He knew how to play his hand, and he was able to convince them to keep the cause going just by racking up victories whenever he needed them. But the war was long and grueling, lasted 10 years, and you have, famous incidents that we hear about, like Valley Forge, where the soldiers nearly froze to death, out there in the wilderness. But the important point is that Washington was able to keep the British fighting long enough until the British were starting to get tired of it. So it was really a war of attrition, and it's not unreasonable to compare it to our involvement in Vietnam. Like when we were fighting Vietnam, we were unquestionably, we had the Viet Cong outmatched. I mean, as far as guns, as far as manpower, as far as everything, we had them outmatched. But the thing is, they were able to strike morale blows to us where after so many years, we questioned why we were doing this. Like, why are we in the jungles of this country fighting these people? What are we fighting for? There's so many dead soldiers coming home. And so Washington conducted a similar thing against the British where after 10 long years, they started to question why they were fighting this war. And, the war became unpopular with the British people, and the British people wanted their sons to quit being sent home in caskets and things like that. And it also needs to be said, we have a misconception about the American Revolution. It comes from movies like The Patriot with Mel Gibson, where we think that the American Revolution was won by frontiersmen who took up tomahawks and went out into the wilderness and, fought the British with their bare hands, shooting them from the trees every here and there. And that's not really the case either, although frontiersmen did play an important role. Actually, the person that gets the least amount of recognition is Daniel Boone. And you've probably heard of Daniel Boone, but you may not know what he's famous for. Daniel Boone was actually a Revolutionary War hero. He was a frontiersman who went out into the Appalachians and was fighting a frontier war against the Indians. But what happened was the British were trying to attack the colonies from the west, and they were trying to come in through the Appalachian Mountains to attack the colonies from the other side. And they had hired and formed an alliance with the native tribes to attack the small outposts and colonies that were set up out there to pave the way for them. And so Daniel Boone was out there fighting the Native Americans to keep the British out from attacking the colonies from that angle. So he doesn't get enough recognition for that. But by and large, the war was not won by frontiersmen. It was won by a trained, disciplined Continental Army led by George Washington, who defeated the British just when they needed to be defeated. And Washington wouldn't have been able to do it without the French. And so the French saw an opportunity. They saw that England was getting bogged down in this war, and they saw an opportunity to go war to war with England again, maybe to get revenge for the French and Indian War or whatever. So the French declared war, and now the British are kind of fighting two wars, and they're starting to get overwhelmed because they're fighting the French in one area, and they're fighting the American colonies, and the French have sided with the American colonies. And General La Follette comes over to America to assist George Washington. There's another general, there's a similar story. He was actually German, and his name was Baron von Steuben. Baron von Steuben was a brilliant military strategist, and he was also a rumored homosexual, and that's why his military career had ended. So he might not have been the ideal choice, but he knew his battlefields. He knew warfare, and so Washington was able to use him as a consultant to help him. So Baron von Steuben, along with General La Follette together, helped whip the Continental Army into shape so that they could go and continue the fight with Great Britain. And so while we would like to think that, we stood up against the most powerful empire in the world and we defeated them, we wouldn't have been able to do it without the assistance of the French. But however it may be, the war continued onward and onward, and Washington's strategy, it didn't seem to people to be working, but it really was, because he was slowly wearing the British down just by having them chase him forever through the woods and scoring small victories here and there. Now, Washington also wanted to take back New York City. He had this obsession, and this isn't talked about that much in the history books. Washington's obsession was with New York. He wanted to get revenge for the loss at the Battle of Long Island. And he had this insane plan that was doomed to failure. And La Follette was warning him constantly, don't do this. This is a bad idea. You don't want to go and try this. But he had this really grand plan to siege New York City and take it back from the British. And it never happened. So General La Follette's idea was to corner Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, and Washington led the way, and that ended up being a victory. When Lord Cornwallis surrendered, effectively that ended the American Revolution. So 10 years of brutal fighting, and against all odds, the Americans managed to win. Now, in your history books, and especially, if you learned history in school, you might think that's the end of the story. That is not the end of the story. That's really the beginning of the story. So the end of the American Revolution was the beginning of the Revolutionary Era, where so Great Britain retreated, but now there's a question of what do we do next? And so the Americans had to establish a government, and they failed catastrophically at this at first. And so I'm a Southerner, and I'm always going to be a proud Southerner. But like I said, I don't believe in whitewashing history, so I try not to look at the Confederacy with too much of idealistic eyes. But I'm going to say this, that the Confederacy made a huge idiotic mistake when they seceded from the Union by forming a confederacy, because the Confederacy had already been a proven failure in the American colonies. So the first thing that the colonies did to try to establish a new nation was the Articles of Confederation, which very, very much limited the power of the centralized federal government. And they were learning the lesson. They didn't want to go back to being, Great Britain. They didn't want to go back to being under a king. So they were limiting that and giving as much power and freedom to the states as possible. But the Union nearly fell apart from the beginning. And so that's why the Constitution had to be put together. And the Constitution was extraordinarily controversial for the reason being it was giving more power to the federal government. And one of the most underrated founding fathers, you've heard of Washington and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, but the man who doesn't get enough credit, enough mention, was James Madison. So James Madison, he came from a wealthy family. He was a little sickly man. He was the youngest of all the founding fathers. He had health problems his entire life, really puny little weakling of a man. But he was a genius. He was absolutely brilliant, and he had been consulted by the founding fathers from the beginning to come together with all these ideas. And so they turned to him when it came to the Constitution. And so Madison actually spent, gosh knows, years studying history as much as he could, studying the history of the Roman Empire, studying the history of ancient Greece, studying, the different constitutions of other nations and putting that all together and coming up with an idea of what a constitution should be. and he sat down and he wrote our Constitution, and he put the Bill of Rights in it, and he put the ability to amend things but not to repeal things completely. So there are scars on the Constitution. So, for example, prohibition was a bad idea, the idea of making alcohol illegal, but you can't completely wipe that out of the Constitution. We'll forget about it. So the next amendment is to repeal the former amendment. And so that way the Constitution always bears the scars of our mistakes from the past, so we'll never forget those. And so the First Amendment, the right to free speech, the separation of church and state, such as what that really means. The Second Amendment, the ability to keep and bear arms, for the freedom of the state, for the individual. James Madison, he wrote those things, he came up with those ideas, he guaranteed those things as right of every free citizen. But the Constitution was controversial. When it was first established, a lot of the states didn't want to ratify it. It wasn't very popular because they felt like it was giving too much power to the government. But it was ultimately ratified, and so it has been our guiding principle for government ever since, even though unconstitutional things have been done by presidents and by Congress. Since then, the Constitution itself, it doesn't change. It gets amended sometimes, but it never changes its basic guiding principles. So, obviously, George Washington was our first president. He didn't want to be president. He didn't want to run for a second term either. He was reluctant to do it. He was tired from years of military service. But he was... Yeah, and it's one of those things where Washington is such a mythical figure to us today. Like, we look at him with this reverence. And there, in the Washington Monument, when you go in and you look up at the ceiling, there's a painting of Washington decked out like Jesus Christ. And the painting is called, on the ceiling, The Deification of George Washington. I mean, that's kind of this mythic sense he has around him. But Washington was a complicated person, and he did things that would be considered controversial today. And actually, during his first term as president, he wasn't really that popular. I mean, he won election. He was popular generally with the people, but you can go back to records back then and see that some of his decisions were very controversial. So, for example, there was a rebellion that took place that almost came to arms, and so I think it was the Whiskey Rebellion, because, now that the U.S. government was in debt from the Revolution, they needed a way to pay it off, and they did the exact same thing the British had done so many years before. So the British had enacted taxes on tea, and so to pay off the French and Indian War, the American colonies enacted a tax on whiskey to try to pay off their war debts. And so there's actually political cartoons from back then that show George Washington as King George III, and they say, we just traded one George for another. But Washington, actually, when the Whiskey Rebellion started, Washington basically, he gathered an army together, and he put on his military uniform, and he summoned the leaders of the rebellion. And he had a meeting with them, and he said, if you continue this, you'll regret it, and I don't want to do that. I don't want to use force to quell this rebellion, but I will, and if you test me, you'll find that out the hard way. And through actually some pretty smart negotiation, he avoided armed conflict. It was a show of force, but it was never a use of force. And so Washington stepped down after 2 terms, and he set the precedent going from then forward. And it wasn't actually in the Constitution to continue that a president could only serve 2 terms. That wasn't until after FDR. But from then onward, that was the precedent that was set. A president only runs. And that kind of was like the symbolic figure of limited government, of we're not going to have a king. We're not going to have a divine ruler who rules for his entire life and leaves a dynasty for us. We'll have a president. We'll have a peaceful transfer of power. Though it could be said that Washington just didn't want to serve a 3rd term. He was tired and getting older, and he just wanted to, live his retirement out at his home in Mount Vernon. But whatever the case may be, he set the precedent from then going forward. So now, here's the thing, that America had been established at this point, and we had a constitution, and we were kind of starting to go forward as a nation. But there were already problems plaguing the nation obviously the divide between slavery, between North and South, was already a problem going back then. And so, like, the Founding Fathers are kind of controversial now because many of them were slave owners, including Washington and Thomas Jefferson. It does need to be said that some of the Founding Fathers were abolitionists, and actually Benjamin Franklin started the abolitionist movement in America. So some of the Founding Fathers deserve credit for being opposed to slavery from the beginning. But the big problem at the time, that was a can that kept getting kicked down the road until it eventually culminated in the Civil War, which we may talk about another time. If there's any topic I love more or more interested in than the American Revolution, it's the Civil War. But the problem at that time was, now let's get into the mindset of Great Britain. So Great Britain had surrendered and they let the colonies have their freedom. However, if you go back a few hundred years to the 1600s, England had gone through a civil war. And it was actually a pretty terrible religious conflict. And it was King Charles I had been deposed by a Puritan named Oliver Cromwell, who had established a military dictatorship. And so for the very first time in English history, it had no king. It had a military dictatorship. And it was very short-lived. And Cromwell was deposed and the monarchy was reestablished. So if you go back, now let's fast forward back to the American Revolution. The British are thinking in their minds that this is all temporary. So when after the surrender at Yorktown, when Lord Cornwallis surrenders, the Great Britain, the Empire, says it's only temporary. Just like Oliver Cromwell, just like the temporary dissolution of the monarchy years before, this is going to fail, and the colonies will come crawling back to us, and they'll be our colonies once again. So Britain continued harassing the American colonists after the war. So even though technically they had won their independence, it didn't really last. And so for the decades following the American Revolution, British sailors continued to harass American sailors. You know, American merchants traveling overseas were constantly being harassed and attacked by British ships. And this ultimately culminated in a war itself, and that would be the War of 1812, even though it didn't just last in the year of 1812. And so the War of 1812 is actually very important to understand the American Revolution because it's actually technically the second American Revolution, and that's why I'm going to include, in our conclusion, where let's talk about the War of 1812. And so the British thought, this is it. This is when we're going to get the colonies back. We are going to, the American experiment is a failure. The United States of America is going to disband and dissolve, and they will come crawling back to us as colonies. And so that's exactly what the British Empire thought they were carrying out. And so James Madison, by that point, was president of the United States. And, it's kind of terrible what happened to America at that point. This young nation, is being tested like it's never been tested before. And so, Washington was sieged, Washington, D.C., the president had to flee, President Madison. And unbeknownst to the British, however, they were going up against somebody they greatly underestimated with. And so there was a man who, when he was a young boy living in Tennessee, his family had suffered great tragedy at the hands of the British. He was a child during the American Revolution, and he hated the British. He hated them with a passion. And he grew up, if there's one group of people he hated more than the Indians, the Native Americans, it was the British. And his name was Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson, the British did not realize who they were going up against with Andrew Jackson, one of the most terrifying psychopaths to ever be president of the United States. You guys think Donald Trump is bad. He's nothing compared to Andrew Jackson. So Jackson was a military general by the time of the War of 1812. And he'd scored some serious victories against the British where nobody else was. And so he was, Old Hickory, Scott Smith jumped in there. Jackson was actually sent to New Orleans because the British, now technically the peace treaty had already been signed and the war was technically over at this point, but really it wasn't over because the British had every intention of continuing to harass the American colony, or America, to get them to come crawling back to the British Empire afterwards. So really the ceasefire at that point was just was just words on paper. And so the British were on their way to siege New Orleans, and Jackson beat them there. And he, using like anybody he could find, he had a small army, but he recruited, African slaves, he recruited Native Americans, he recruited homeless people, he recruited everybody he could to build the most impressive fort he could. And so he led the British into a trap because he stationed himself in a place where the only way they could get to him was by going down a small strip of land that was sandwiched between trees and then a body of water in the Gulf Coast. And so when the British were led into this trap, the Americans were hopelessly outnumbered, but the British, they could only climb uphill on the small they could only march up this small channel of land to get to the fort to attack it. And because Jackson had the upper hand, he absolutely devastated them with cannon fire and with gunfire. And it was absolutely the most crushing defeat in the history of the British Empire. Over 2,000 British troops were killed and only 8 Americans were killed in the battle. So that was the most catastrophic defeat the British had ever suffered. And they retreated in complete, utter defeat. And Jackson would go on to become president. Like I said, he was one of the scariest presidents we've ever had. Jackson would be the first president that anyone attempted to assassinate, and he survived the assassination attempt. And not only that, the man tried to kill him, and he got away, and then Jackson actually chased the man down and beat him nearly to death with his cane. So, yeah, Andrew Jackson, an interesting character in history. So, the War of 1812 was really the second War of Independence, and it was from that point forward that the British left the United States of America alone. And the War of 1812 also produced our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. During a particular siege, Francis Scott Key was there listening to the bombardment all night long, but kept looking out and seeing the Star-Spangled Banner, still not having surrendered yet. And he wrote the poem that would become our national anthem. So happy 4th of July, everyone. I just really love the topic of American history, especially the early history. And so with this being the 4th of July, I just thought it was a great opportunity to talk about the founding of America and, all the struggles and things that we had to go through to get there. That's how you get on the $20 bill. That's very true. What do you do to get on a $50 bill? That's the real interesting question. So anyway, I'm going to end right there. So if you came in late, like I always say, you can just let this video start and play from the beginning. And hope you all have a happy, safe July 4th. I know it's kind of difficult with the virus still going around, with still living under a pandemic. But, so many things have come against the United States of America, as we've seen, and we're going through this, and we got through those, and we're going to get through this as well. So you all have a good night. Enjoy time with your family. Enjoy your cookouts. Enjoy your fireworks. Enjoy everything. God bless America. See you all later.